Severity of risk can be classified by the type of loss. So a catastrophic loss is when something like a tornado comes through and damages and completely destroys an entire facility. A critical loss occurs when a facility can be partially damaged. A moderate loss happens. It might require immediate attention, like a person falling and breaking a leg. And then low losses happen on a much smaller scale. So maybe somebody sprays graffiti on something or tries to steal a logo off of a sponsorship banner or steals the banner. In addition to severity of risk, sport managers must look at the frequency of risk. So high frequency means that the chance of an incident occurring is very likely under the given circumstances. Medium frequencies are incidents that are not unusual and are likely to occur on occasion, but not always. Finally, low frequency incidents are those that rarely occur, such as a catastrophic event. There are several ways to reduce risk. The first is establishing policies and procedures that your staff know how to follow, including emergency action plans. You want to train your staff in these policies so that they know the rules, so that they can also figure out how to manage the risks in front of them. You want to try to foresee risks happening. So again, that goes back to the develop, implement, and manage the risk, that process. Classify the risk in severity in terms of frequency also, so that you can have a better idea of what to expect and to have people be on the lookout for moderate risks that occur regularly, like people falling, maybe people drinking too much, and figuring out how to manage that. And then finally, you want to treat risks, and I'll talk more about that on the next slide. There are 4 different ways to treat risks. The first, avoidance. Basically, you eliminate the risk by eliminating the program, facility, or service that gives rise to a potential risk. So perhaps it's you don't want to deal with people drowning in your pool, so as a facility, you decide you're going to close the pool. The next is transfer. This is where you place the risk and liability on another person through a lease or contract. So maybe you hire a company to conduct a clinic, and then therefore they take the liability and the risk, and your organization does not have to. Retention is basically you do nothing and keep the situation as is. And then reduction is essentially you're taking action to reduce the risk, such as covering sprinklers on soccer fields and so on. The next series of slides discusses relevant laws or bodies of law that sport managers need to be aware of. Tort law is a body of law designed to help people that were harmed by others, particularly in the form of negligence. Negligence occurs when someone sustains a personal injury, but there's actually no intent to cause the injury. In order to win a negligence lawsuit, a plaintiff would have to prove these 4 things. 1, that there was a standard of care that the person that harmed them did not live up to. So the second would be there's a breach of duty, meaning whatever they did, they failed to meet the existing standard of care. The next is that action or inaction actually caused the injury. And then finally, there was an actual injury, either physical or emotional harm. So say, for example, a coach brings their student athletes out to this basketball court, somebody gets injured, the coach's duty is to protect their student athletes from physical and emotional harm. They breached that duty because bringing them to this court caused the injury and they broke their ankle, thus there's an injury. There are a couple primary defenses to negligence. The first is assumption of risk. This means that there is an inherent risk in certain things, particularly sport participation, and that the person, when they engaged in the act, either playing basketball like on the previous slide, they assumed the risk of the activity. Though if you sign a waiver, you have people sign waivers that may help minimize your liability, or you post signs around a facility that warn people about the risk that they're about to engage in. That also helps minimize your liability. The next thing is contributory negligence. This is basically the defense's way to say that the person sustained an injury by the fact that they contributed to their own injury. So whatever they did ended up causing their injury and it wasn't the fault of the defendant. A law that's relevant to sport managers is Title IX. So Title IX applies to all schools receiving federal funding, both public and private. And the idea behind the law was that it was to ensure gender equality in education. And sport is part of the educational component. So the three areas that Title IX enforces are financial assistance. So that's the idea that you need to give, particularly in colleges and universities, similar financial aid to both male and female students. Equality in program areas means that equipment, locker rooms, practice spaces, and times need to be similar for both men and women's teams. And then finally, effective accommodation is the idea that you provide opportunities for female student athletes when your organization, your college, your university, your high school is not in compliance with Title IX. In order to determine whether institutions are in compliance with Title IX, there's what's called a three-pronged test. So you can look at proportionality, which is basically examining the proportion of the overall student body to what exists in the athletic department for male and female student athletes. So if your school is 60% female and 40% male, your athletic department should have opportunities that reflect that. So there should be 60% female student athletes and 40% male student athletes. Accommodation refers to, again, the same in the previous slide, that if you have a group of female student athletes that have ability, that have desire to participate in a varsity sport, and you are out of compliance, then you need to provide or accommodate them. And you can do that with continued expansion, which is basically adding teams. Another law that's relevant to sport managers is the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. Two titles in particular. Title I applies to employment discrimination for people with disabilities, and the idea was to create opportunities for people with disabilities who had been excluded from the workforce. So in order to bring a claim forward, if a person thinks they've been discriminated against, they need to prove they have a disability, prove that they were qualified for a job, and then also prove that they were excluded from the job because of a disability. Title III of the ADA prohibits discrimination in public accommodations. So this means that things like stadiums and public transportation need to include or have spaces for people with disabilities. So what this looks like in a stadium is that you can't just put people with disabilities in terrible seats. They need to have a visible sight line in which they can get to and from their seats and actually be able to watch the game like a person does that does not have a physical disability. The key points from this lecture are the DIM process, so develop, implement, manage. So the purpose again is to be proactive, to try to minimize risk. Preventing all risk is really difficult, but if you can be proactive and identify, assess, and classify risk and create this plan, then ideally you can help your organization or prevent them from being sued. There are a lot of different ways to reduce risk. You can create policies and procedures. You want to train your staff continually, identify those risks, and then, the 4 ways: reduce, retain, and so on. And then negligence, basically know that you probably have a standard of care that you need to meet. You need to make sure you satisfy those duties, that your action or inaction doesn't cause any injuries, and so on. And then finally, the last couple laws pertain to gender and disability discrimination and impact sport managers.